whatever liberalist philosophy might dictate about the concept of suicide in the modern world, there is something very wrong with a society that is just Facebook comment sad about a 17-year-old who hangs herself in her room when nobody is looking. Each life lost is a problem. It's a tragedy, a sadness in itself. But we also consider as the government the continuously increasing number or trend of lives lost because of this kind of thinking, that it is okay for a person to take his or her own life upon her own decision because somehow the decision to take death instead of life is always a rational, respectable one. Within those grounds, the proposition would propose to you today that Google should notify the state authorities when anyone searches for resources that glorify or encourage suicide. Today, state authorities in this motion would notify family members or government officials, depending on need and depending on situation, that a certain person might be contemplating suicide. So thank you. And to define glorify or encourage suicide, we would say that either A, they depict suicide in a positive way. For example, say that parents or friends will finally regret how bad they treated you, for example, if you commit suicide, such narratives as those. Second of all, we would also consider sites that provide explicit instructions on suicide. Now, we're not talking about shutting down these sites because that is a separate issue altogether. But we consider that these people repeatedly going on such sites is a clear sign that they may be contemplating suicide. It is good if they are not. But if there is a repeated sign, we think that state has grounds for intervention in this case because suicide is a unique case, a unique problem in the status quo, as our case will explain. So thank you. Now, the proposition carries three burdens of proof. The first, that there is a clear harm to suicide in society. Second, that government has active interest in preventing suicide. And third, ultimately, our model would save lives. So today the proposition has three arguments. The first being problem identification, that we would justify uniqueness of situation in the face of privacy of information that this motion calls into question. Yes, sir.
Would your side support this policy for matters such as encouraging and glorifying domestic abuse or encouraging and glorifying terrorism?
No, because in the case of encouraging domestic abuse or encouraging terrorism, there are so many different ways to regulate that, right? Because domestic violence is not secretive, it's something physical in the outside. And also terrorism is that way as well. There needs to be more communication, there needs to be concrete action, and we do have measures to regulate that. But suicide is a secretive one. It's done within one's private grounds, often in one's room, and in an increasingly isolated society within one's own mind, without any chance to express his or her own fears. That is why we believe today that this is a unique situation. So thank you, ma'am. Now, the second argument is going to be about government responsibility. How not only is life valuable in itself, the state has active interest and duty in preventing suicide. And thirdly, the deputy will come up and talk about the breakdown of barriers to interaction, why suicide, again, is such a unique problem in the status quo. Moving on to the first argument, Mr. and Madam Speakers. Now consider what kind of people commit suicide. What kind of people make such an ultimate sad decision? For example, a 17-year-old who is tortured at school, like I mentioned in the introduction, or a 24-year-old bankrupt and not seeing any way out of that, or a 42-year-old going through a horrific divorce. Statistics tell us there is a very clear common characteristic of all these people we see in newspapers, Facebook, and even in our own neighborhoods and families. First of all, they are temporarily or permanently socially vulnerable and weak. Secondly, they truly believe that the people around them cannot help them, or moreover that they don't care. And third, they are secretive, mostly alone, ashamed or / unwilling to talk about the fact that they are contemplating divorce. Fourth, ironically, they are afraid of suicide because it causes pain. And there is that golden time where people start considering suicide and actually commit suicide, right? And then fifth, we also know, sadly, that from all the people who attempted and failed in suicide, that the moment that they do that decisive action, they regret committing to suicide, right? So the fact that they want to end their life is not necessarily true, and so it is best if we can. I think we can all agree that it is best if we can prevent suicide. And we also told you that we also live in an increasingly isolated world where people spend hours of their time communicating impersonally, with their phones, with their computers, online. And so current safeguards like the counseling service or monitoring in schools or friends and family oftentimes don't work. The desire to commit suicide, Mr. and Madam Speaker, in this isolated world is often communicated on the net in seeking information, in seeing options. I've already talked to you about that golden time, right? Between a person starting to contemplate suicide and then thinking about what that means, and then also contemplating ways to actually enact that, and actually committing that suicide. There's a very specific timeline in which without attention at the right moment, people will commit suicide. And we know that because we live in a more isolated world, this attention within that golden framework isn't happening in the status quo, and that it is getting worse. No, thank you, ma'am. So we believe that in most cases, less communications on the net are invaluable to attacking people, to preventing suicide in that golden time. If we don't take advantage of this, we cannot prevent suicide by any other measure. So moving on to the second argument, the first argument proves to you that we do need a kind of intervention at a specific timeline which justifies the invasion of perhaps information privacy because life is so important. That's what the second argument is proving, that life is so important that this measure is more than justified, right? I've told you in the beginning that there is a liberalist philosophy that people should be free to take their own lives because it's their own lives and theirs alone. In this argument, I'm going to tell you why that's wrong, why state has an active interest and duty to prevent people from making irrational decisions to take their own lives and impacting society in a highly negative way. First of all, we think that life has actively to do with sustenance of society, but moreover, there's an inherent value to that because everything that a democratic society stands for, like how a person deserves human dignity or a person deserves to be happy, directly clashes against a government that condones suicide because life is the source of all those principles. That life in itself is so valuable that if a person possesses life, they are due to all these benefits and all these rights to human dignity, right? So we think that when a state has a reasonable interest in guaranteeing that when people make that ultimate decision, certain safeguards can prevent against the rash ones. And we've also told you that most of those decisions are rash, right? So we think that the value of life is something that the government, in a democratic liberalist government, should actively protect and promote, right? But second of all, we also want to tell you about the social effect, the chain effect, that when a person commits suicide, with each life lost, the barrier to suicide is lowered to our society. We think that, if a person next door committed suicide because her life was too hard, then maybe it's okay for me to commit suicide and nobody would care, right? So we think that there is that kind of chain effect. For example, you go to a YouTube channel that contemplates suicide, explains how you can hang yourself effectively without failing. Then we will see in comments about how people talking about how miserable they are, how they would really like to put into action what that YouTube channel is telling them to do, right? Yes, not everyone who does that commits suicide, but we need to admit that a majority does, and the one way to tell if that person does is whether they leave that comment on Facebook or not. So we think that at the end, the only way for the government to knowingly prevent suicide would be to rely on these internet searches, and because of that, and because they have that duty to prevent suicide, at the end, the proposition's case needs to stand. Thank you very much.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 23 seconds.
Right, we thank the speaker for her speech. We now invite first speaker from the opposition.
Let's not kid ourselves today. When the FBI investigated Martin Luther King's extramarital affairs, they thought they were doing it in the guise of saving lives by preventing civil unrest. And when a bunch of other nations and a bunch of other governmental organizations feel like they're doing the right thing under the guise of protecting their citizens, under the guise of protecting the lives of those individuals, we know what they're actually doing. And that is they want to monitor us and they want to make sure that our civil liberties are taken away. Their burden on today's debate is that they have to prove that this gigantic precedent in which a country can literally go into a person's bedroom and see what they're searching online, outweighs the harms of outweighs the small benefit of making sure that a couple people don't commit suicide within today's society. Because if we think about it, from things like bomb making to terrorism to flying planes into the World Trade Center, we could all do the things under their policy. Why? So let's hear what exactly proposition side told you today. They gave you a 3 set criteria. Number 1, there needs to be a clear harm. Number 2, it is in the active interest of the government to prevent this. And number 3, that it saves lives. Now let's talk about domestic abuse, because domestic abuse is exactly the case here. There is obviously direct harm with domestic abuse. There is obviously an active interest for the state to stop that, and there is an active interest for the state to save lives, because domestic abuse can often lead to that when alcohol and those kinds of things are involved. The same thing with terrorism, the same thing with bomb making, the same thing with virtually anything that causes harm to a society. So we think on their side it's actively very problematic if they characterize it like that. And then their justification for this, and why suicide is especially unique, is that there are other ways of solving terrorism. There are other ways, and that domestic abuse is somehow not hidden within the home. We'd like to challenge that characterization from the very beginning. Domestic abuse is not always visible to outside society, because these women often hide their own bruises, and it's often not clear whether or not that actually happens in the first place. But secondly, terrorism also. If you can do anything to prevent those planes from flying into the World Trade Center, you would have done that under your policy. Yes, sir.
So you're saying because of those reasons, we should do absolutely nothing to help people who are suicidal?
We don't think that's the case, ladies and gentlemen. We think that what we're talking about is that there are other ways of combating suicide, like counseling, literally counseling, which will have a much less of an impact on the kind of civil liberties that you're encroaching upon. You're literally having the most draconian policy of literally going into everybody's bedrooms and making sure that if they search something about suicide, you're going to talk about them. Because, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about it. Because not everybody who searches this on the internet is already contemplating suicide in the first place. Whatever happened to the principle of innocent until proven guilty? Whatever happened to the premise of you need a search warrant because the court sees that you have a reasonable suspicion of doing such actions? So furthermore, on their arguments of number 1, how they actively stated this, and secondly, on how life is so valuable. So on their first argument of how it actively saves lives and how it's actually so important because certain people are so vulnerable. We already told you this is already existing for other cases as well. And number 2, we also tell you that this is not absolute. The principle that the state needs to support somebody is not absolute. And in fact, their solution does nothing. Because, ladies and gentlemen, let's remind ourselves, what was their solution? Their solution was basically to redirect these people to a site that teaches them why not to commit suicide. Now let's talk about how ludicrous this is. Because a person who's about to commit suicide is not going to read a laundry list of details on why not to commit suicide and say, you know what, I guess I shouldn't commit suicide after all. That person has been irrationally changed to an extent in which he has not been able to stop that unless he gets that kind of counseling which he needs right then. Yes. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we also tell you that on their second argument on why it's somehow, quote-unquote, life is so valuable, we tell you in the plethora of other things, we think that suicide is one of the lesser things that actually cause death within our society. We ask you, why doesn't the state provide health insurance if they think that life provides sustenance and is so valuable? Because if we provided health insurance, that would have cost hundreds of thousands more lives. We would have saved those individuals. Why don't we ban smoking? Why don't we ban alcohol? And we're not completely running a negative case here. We're just pointing out the flaws in the logic that the state must always protect life. We don't think that the quantity of life is important, so as long as you decrease the quality of that life to an extent in which it provides a legal precedent that is extremely dangerous. So what are our arguments today? We bring you 3 arguments today. Firstly, on the importance of privacy, even in cases where it actively might harm some lives. And secondly, on how there's a problem-solution mismatch within the opposition side's model. But before we move on, we also like to say that the other ways and alternatives that the state can actively provide that would stop this kind of thing would be all ranging from public service announcements to literally providing counseling to the teenagers that they've been talking about within those schools, counseling to the teenagers who teachers have been seeing disruptive signals from. So on to our first argument of the importance of privacy, even in cases where it might lead to loss of certain life. Because let's be clear, the reason the government wants this kind of information is not inherently because it wants to save lives. If they inherently wanted to save lives, they would have done other policies as well. But we think that privacy on a day-to-day basis is especially important. We believe that privacy has a tangible benefit. And what is that tangible benefit? We think that privacy as a tangible benefit because it has the ability to give us a personal space in which we say whatever we want to say, and we're not affected by social pressures or governmental pressures that might affect us as well. And we think that this is not just about suicide, but the second the government says, hey, I have the power to regulate what you say on Google, the second the government goes into your bedroom and looks at what you're typing up on Google search and looks at your search history, that's the very second in which you are scared to search certain things on Google. That's the very second you become paranoid of the government, and that's the second you open the floodgates for so many other things. Because the principle that you should protect that kind of liberty, the principle is, when that principle is exactly destroyed under their model, that's when the floodgates are opened, and comparing and weighing the benefits of saving a few lives of those individuals that very well could be saved with other methods, counseling, public service announcements, and giving that up for this immense problematic solution that they've been talking about is extremely problematic. And we think that we'd also like to question how they're going to actually do this, because their standard was extremely subjective. We think that the reason this glorifying and encourage subjectivity is present, and they haven't given you clear examples of it, is because the government actively wants to monitor these kinds of individuals, because they want to restrict the kind of speech that they can have, because they're afraid of this kind of dissent. So on to our second argument. Before I move on to my second argument, yes, ma'am.
Google will transfer certain information to the government. It's not that the government can look through search histories or emails within that.
Man, we think that's especially problematic because that's number one, the kind of exactly the kind of logic the NSA gave the United States of America. Number two, we also tell you that on your case, when you say that, oh, Google is going to transfer the information to the United States government, we think that that very second, when there's that kind of cooperation between those two entities, and one entity has vastly more power than the other entity, that entity has the power to force the entity into doing something that they otherwise wouldn't have. Just look at the PRISM program and how the US government forced Google to send all of its metadata to their servers in the NSA in the United States of America and Nevada. So on to our second argument of the actual problem-solution mismatch. We think it is a misallocation of resources. How is it a misallocation of resources? Because the National Security Agency themselves have been complaining about the vast amount of data that they've been receiving from these kinds of from these kinds of places. So we think that when you are looking for a needle in a haystack, you don't increase the size of that haystack to try to find that needle better. Rather, you look for prioritizations of how you can find that needle better. And we think in those cases, because we ensure that civil liberties are protected, and because we ensure that their side isn't able to hide under the guise and the smoke screen of wanting to save lives, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds.
Right, we thank the speaker for that speech, and we now invite the second speaker of the government team, the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speakers, Madam Speakers, it's an obvious fact that no one really wants to die, because we all want to live. But the unfortunate fact that we see today is that some people, at a state of huge emotional pain, believe that their life has more meaning after death, that they will affect more people after dying. At this moment, Mr. and Madam Speakers, when people want to live but also believe that their death has more meaning, we think it's very important that someone steps in and does tell them that your life does have meaning and you do not necessarily have to die for any meaning to have place. And we think it's very wrong for team government to suggest that it is the responsibility of the suicidal person to find the counselor or to go out and seek help when we think that help should be given to them. And we're going to further tell you during our rebuttals why their entire argument about how there should be internet security and information security is something that is not so crucial when we consider the fact that suicide and people who are willing to commit suicide and is at the golden time of committing suicide, that they are people that we can really help, that we can really save, and it's not like maybe we can or maybe we can't, we actually can, and we're going to prove it to you. But our third argument is going to be how we break down the barriers to interaction and the psyche of the people who actually look into these sites. But before we do that, we'd like to respond to the points made by the previous team. The first thing they told us was that, what about terrorism? What about domestic violence? What about all these other things that can also be classified as people we need to save? But we think that there's two obvious responses to this. The first response would be to repeat what our previous speaker has already told you, that there is a difference between terrorism and there is a difference between suicide. Because within suicide, that when someone really wants to commit suicide and is at the brink of committing suicide, it is at that moment that we can really reach out to them and help them. But that kind of action cannot be taken if someone does not take it. Most of the time, people want help but are not willing to look out for help.
Sir.
That is why it is so important and crucial that we have a mechanism in which people wanting to die will then be stopped and told that they don't have to die. But moving on, Mr. Speaker, they also tried to nitpick about something else. They also told us, what about information privacy? That if we do this, this is going to lead to something else, and all our porn records are going to be seen by government officials, and this is going to be horrible. We're going to tell you why this, one, won't happen, but two, we're willing to risk it. Number one, we tell you that the main actor here, while being the government, is also Google. We are asking Google to give the records to us. And unlike what they tried to portray, this is actually a rather simple method. Google will be giving like how many the keyword searches, how many times that person has searched that website, how long that person has been on that website. These kind of numbers and numerical things in which people can decide whether the families of the people, suicidal people, should be notified or whether the government should send people over there right away. This is not a gross, we don't think that this is a gross invasion of privacy. We're not looking through your emails, we're looking through your keyword searches because we are very afraid that you are a person who are about to die that we could have saved. That if you were willing to do this, that we could have saved your life, but we are not being able to save their life because we're afraid that the big brother is going to be looking at other things too. But that's not going to happen. But even if it does happen, no thank you, we are willing to risk it, Mr. and Madam Speakers, because we believe that these people who have suffered so much, not just by themselves, but because society has abandoned them, we believe that we have a responsibility to take care of these people who are not being taken care of by society. And we believe that this is best done when there is an actor who's willing to come and step in instead of waiting for them to find their own counselor. We do not think that this being status quo is something that is going to drastically improve the situation, unlike us. They also told us that there is going to be a misallocation of resources and it is going to be better set doing something else. We think this is ridiculous, Mr. and Madam Speaker, because we're not real government officials trying to allocate resources and creating a policy. We tell you, first of all, if this policy was able to be feasibly done, then would you do it? Because we think we absolutely would. But two, even if it's hard to do, and we don't think it's that hard because we're just asking for keyword searches, NSA agents aren't going to be reading emails, we're just going to be receiving information about how many times you clicked and how long you looked at things, and then sending that information to your families. We don't think this is too hard to ask, and we don't think it's too big to ask when you consider the consequences of not taking this action. The consequences of not taking this action is abandoning a person who was already abandoned by a society and is willing to die in order to have any sort of impact upon society. And we think this is very wrong. But now we're going into our third argument about the psyche and how we are breaking down barriers to interaction. We think that under our paradigm, looking through sites about how to commit suicide and looking through how glorification of suicide can also be considered as serving a double purpose as an indirect call for help. Because what is the psyche of a suicidal person? You can't freely talk to other people about what you're going under. Because oftentimes, the things that make you want to commit suicide are so humiliating, so violent, that you can't really talk to other people about it. That if you believe that if you tell this to someone else, that they will also undergo that same pain, or they won't really care, in which case you'll be pain even further. Yes?
If that individual has gone so far in his decision to commit suicide, what makes you think that your policy of making him read a laundry list of examples on why not to commit suicide would help him?
It is not a laundry list of reasons why not to commit suicide. This is how it works. That person looks into a site that glorifies suicide and tells this person, committing suicide will make your parents sad and make you respected. Then the government is going to tell your family that your son is trying to commit suicide, or even send the person if it's that dangerous. It's not something like that. But we're going to tell you here, if something like that does happen, if someone is over the brink, we think that even with people who are over the brink, just as I've been telling you right now, how they can't freely talk about this, they still want to be stopped. Because no one wants to die. Everyone wants to live. And if we had a chance to live, we would probably take it. But that chance is never given to us because we're not willing to actively go out and ask for a counselor and tell them, this is the kind of pain we're having. But what happens here under our model is that if you subconsciously or unconsciously or like purposely look through this kind of material, then your family is going to be notified, people are going to know that this is what you're thinking, and then they're going to be able to send help. So this is in fact an indirect form, an indirect request for help. You do not have to go to a counselor. If you do search these things, people will come to you. We think this is a very important fact. We think that there should absolutely be no burden upon the suicidal person to actively go out and seek out help. We think this is very wrong. We told you that it is already society's fault for neglecting that person. It cannot be society's fault that we let them die because we want some extra privacy. We don't think we have any right to say in that matter. We would also tell you what happens after this indirect call for help happens. People are going to come and help. Government officials can help. Your family can help. People will be notified about your situation, and you're going to be able to find hope in your life and want to continue on living because you understand that your government is willing to use those misallocated resources to make sure that you don't want to die. We think that this in itself is very important, Mr. Speaker. That people care about you, that your government is willing to look through records and make sure that you're not someone that they could have saved but didn't save, Mr. Speaker. We tell you what happens here is that we inspire confidence to our government and within society from the perspective of people who want to commit suicide, who believe that they've been absolutely cast off from even their parents and closest friends. We give this kind of safety net and we ensure to them that there are people looking after you, there are people who care about you, and we do not want you to die. So in conclusion, Mr. and Madam Speakers, we absolutely do not think that our society should be the one to further throw away these people to the brink of death. We have already pushed them here, therefore it is our duty to bring them back. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 20 seconds.
Right, we thank the speaker for the speech and now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
If we had medical checkups on everyone in South Korea before the person that came back from Middle East, then we would not have MERS and we would have a more productive tournament where we would be able to have the judges be judged, or debaters be judged by better, judges here. And we would also be able to prevent all murders if we had all the CCTVs. Sorry, we think you guys are all great, but we think that we'd be able to prevent all murders if we had all CCTVs located all around South Korea. We think that the side that the proposition has been taking is a very extreme side because that advocates for the fact that government will go any line and go to an extent in which they will do anything to protect the citizens. And they sneakily try to sneak in the three burdens: the clear harm to suicide, the government active interest, and third, saving lives in order to make sure that it sounded like they were being exclusive about committing suicide only. However, as my leader of opposition has already pointed to you out, there are so many examples in the status quo, like domestic abuse, terrorism, and the laundry list goes on and on and on. But we think the proposition has been failed to prove to us the exclusive harm and the exclusive reason why we have to provide this extra warrant in order to allow people to search on Google. And in my speech, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do two things for you. Firstly, I'm going to rebut the team opposition and tell them, firstly, the mechanism aspect that they failed, and secondly, the fact that they failed to analyze the psyche of these suicidal people. And then secondly, I'm going to move on to my argument, which is about the government mistrust. Because we think that the team opposition has failed to even point out how far and how extreme the opposition has gone to. Let's move on to our first rebuttal, mechanism. We think that team opposition simply told us, team proposition simply told us, the mechanism will work because we have the numbers, we have the statistics. But first, ladies and gentlemen, how much does that number of times you searched of I want to commit suicide or how to commit suicide tell you about that one particular person? Because Sophie came out here in her PM speech and told us a great rhetoric about how, there's a golden time that we must analyze these people. There's that time we have to tell the family, tell their friends, tell them there has to be a counseling. But we don't think that a number of statistics on search engine will be able to analyze or tell the identity of a person at all. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the resource allocation. We think in the status quo, team population would like to say, it is not the problem of the government, it is merely the fact that we have not been able to have enough data or enough resources to make sure that suicides are being prevented. Actually, no. We think that in the status quo, example of Colorado shooter who has actually decided to shoot in the theater, but he's called the hotline before he shot in the theater. We think in the status quo, it is not just the problem of the fact that we don't have enough resources, it's not the fact that we don't have enough people outside, it's the fact that we don't allocate it enough. And therefore, simply expanding the pool of data on which how many times or how many people search up how many number of times you search up suicide is not necessarily going to tell you the representation of our society, the urgency of our society of that one particular person. Let's move on to our second point, which I think is more important, the psyche of that person. Junbum inspired me to tell you what kind of psyche the suicidal person may have, because he pointed to you out that these people are lonely, isolated, have no friends, and are segregated and discriminated from society. We think then, in that case, teen population, it fails even more drastically because they don't seem to care about the people that they say they care. Domestic abuse, bullying, terrorism, they say that, you know what, these people will be able to have the resources in the government, but what are they doing? Nothing. They're literally leaving it out in the status quo and saying that the government policies today are efficient enough, but not exclusively giving us the benefit of suicide itself. We think that teen population has to give us and come up to us with an exclusive benefit of this particular motion be passed and only for suicide. But also, ladies and gentlemen, we want to analyze what kind of thoughts go into these suicidal people. How do they think and what kind of thoughts are going into these minds? Ladies and gentlemen, what happens when you actually have a data and say a statesman decides that this person is suicidal, we must check upon this person. What happens? That statesman will probably phone up the family members, the community. They will go up to the schools, the counselors, and make sure that this person is somewhat being counseled for. How is that even beneficial for that person, ladies and gentlemen? We think that the mechanism is wrong because, ladies and gentlemen, it may solve the problem of that one particular person, forcing that person to be counseled, but how are we changing the social arena to minimize suicide itself? We're only tackling the problem in the direct form, in the indirect form in which you say, you know what, this person is suicidal, and therefore now we're going to tackle the problem. We think it has to come even before that. We think the root of the problem is from the fact that the government is unable to allocate their resources properly. The government is simply blaming on the lack of data instead of looking at how lack of counselors we have, how lack of awareness we have in our society. We think that teen population has to go more general step and tell us that society has to change, not that Google has to provide us with more statistics. Yes, sir.
So under our paradigm, we are saving that one or numerous people. But under your case, who are you saving?
We think that in the status quo, firstly, we're not just getting rid of or abandoning this one person. Because in the status quo, we allow counselings to happen. We allow discouragements to happen. We make sure and actively the government takes part. We also have search warrants when it seems obvious that this person may be suicidal. We have seen many examples of which when a person has posted things about how she wants to commit suicide, the friends or the family members will post a report to the police officer, therefore alarming and warning these people about the counseling programs that she may need and how she needs to be protected. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we're not just tackling that one person, but we're tackling the general society as a whole. And that general society as a whole does not come from the fact that you have more database. It comes from the fact that you're going to have more friendly people in your schools. You're going to make sure that your family members care more about you. And how does that happen? Only when the government takes a step back, allows more flexibility, allows the fact that the environment changes, not that data increases. Let's move on to my argument, which is going to tell you more about how the government intervention is going to worsen the problem. Third argument, government mistrust. Now, firstly, Jenna, what happens in the usage of internet, right? People have to feel trusted. Just because I have the internet online, or I'm not just going to search up anything, because I think that all of the information that I'm going to be processed will be kept by Google, and it releases a huge detriment to privacy. But that's not just it, ladies and gentlemen. We think that once people start to think that their data is being transferred to statesmen, they have an exacerbation and detriment to their freedom of choice. How does that work? Because in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, we think the government has not been able to give trust to the citizens. We have continuously seen that WikiLeaks or many other people have told us that the government has been lying to us. And in these situations when the citizens are already mistrusting the government, how can we make sure that citizens are safely looking up and searching up their own private information even online? die. We don't think that is even possible. And therefore, when citizens feel that all of their information on all of their search engines become leaked and also available to the government, we think that it is a huge infringement of their own freedom of choice as well. We think this is the exact novel that I read in my 11th grade, which I did not think was going to be beneficial, but it is. 1984, Brave New World. We think that the huge Big Brother that we see in Team Proposition is only going to monitor. First they would come committing suicide, and then we're going to have more CCTVs, and then we're going to make sure that everything is instilled even in your bedroom. We think the gradual discussion of that escalation of intensity and empowerment of the government is going to increase, and we will not be able to see the limitations from Team Proposition at all. And therefore, because we see a Brave New World 1984 from Team Proposition, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes.
Right, we thank the speaker for the speech. We now invite the third speaker from the government team, the government way. Yeah.
Drop the mic. I'm out.
Apologies. That again? While side opposition is talking about these psychological or familiar ways to solve suicide, we think that the status quo proves that those methods are limited, that those methods have inherent limitations. That's what we told you on our side of the house. We were talking about the inherent characteristics of suicide. We told you that people inherently, while they do want to live, feel that society has abandoned them, feel that they cannot talk about their problems to other people. And that is precisely why the alternatives that side has provided to us don't actually work. That being said, we think that opposition tries to wear down this debate by comparing this to stuff like NSA, trying to widen the problem of privacy. But we tell you on our side of the house that from the beginning of the debate, we gave you a strict standard on which this policy is implemented. So I'm going to be talking about the standards in the first clash, about the reason why we believe that this policy is justified, and secondly then talking about the effect of the policy on our side of the house. So firstly, we tell you that on our side that information privacy can be outweighed by the state's interest to regulate this sort of activity due to a number of reasons. The first of those is that we think that there is a specific instance that we're talking about here. The first response that side opposition gave you in this area is that there's a difference existing between, there isn't a difference to this and other forms of violence that might possibly exist within society, like terrorism, like domestic violence. Here's the critical difference between those kind of things and suicide. We think that looking up suicide is a decisive action on part of people when they decide to do violence. But moreover, we think that suicide is a contemplative action that you don't talk about to other people, right? We think that that's different from conflicts with other people, which is the case with domestic violence. We think that when you look up violence, moreover, that is one of the very, very few ways in which you can ascertain whether a person has committed suicide or not. We think that, as we told you, the vast majority of suicides don't get talked about. The problems that those people encounter in life aren't talked about to other people. We think that is a massive difference on our side of the house that we defended adequately, that we defended consistently throughout this debate that a side opposition hasn't responded to so far. That being said, we think there are three main things that we would say regarding this policy that might make it specific. Firstly, there's a specific instance in which this policy takes place when a person has looked up a case of suicide. And what we told you on our side is that there's a strict correlation between searching those things up on Google and then contemplating the action of committing suicide. That's why the first and second speakers talked about the golden time in which those things might happen, right? Secondly, we think that in the vast majority of cases, the sort of alternative that this side has discussed so far don't actually work. Because things like public announcements and counseling can only affect the people who are contemplating suicide if society knows whether that conflict is taking place in the first place within a person's mind. We tell you that on that side of the house, they didn't have a mechanism in which those kind of things
would take place, other than this idea that society has to change and that friends and family would look out to each other. We don't think that was specific, we don't think that was adequate, and we don't think that actually provided any change to the status quo that we were talking about on our side of the house. Thirdly, the information that we requested on our side of the house is specific, and as the second speaker told you, we think that we're mainly talking about something that we call metadata, something that is something about the records in something specific, as in the records in which those searches took place, right? So with regard to the NSA example that they gave you, to try and expand the privacy violations, we have a number of objections to this idea. Firstly, because in the case of the NSA surveillance, there was no strict standard given. The strict standard, quote unquote, was any search keyword that might indicate that the person is affiliated with terrorism. That extends to people who search how to make a bomb, from a person who searches for a terrorist organization. There are many more instances in which that might be applied. Secondly, we don't think that there was any transparency in the NSA, right? Before Edward Snowden revealed these things out, we think what happened was that there were warrants issued by the secretive FISA court, 500 out of 500 which were submitted and allowed, right? We think that this sort of transparency is given on our side of the house because the organization that is doing this policy is Google. It is giving specific information to other people, to the government, and that's not something that was in the case of the NSA. Thirdly, we think that there are a vast number of alternatives that the government could and did take in that sort of situation to counter problems with terrorism, like airport searches, for instance, which is completely another debate. But the point here is that in order to counter terrorism in this sort of situation, there are so many other ways which you might be able to do this. Because terrorism is an action that is done outside, it has to be carried out, for example, outside of a passport and with passport checks, with airport checks, for instance, that actually makes it easier to detect. We don't think that's the case inside of suicide. So the first objection against their idea that information privacy is something that is eroded on our side of the house is something that we fundamentally reject. But secondly, even if to a certain extent they could prove that this sort of erosion happened, we think on our side of the house that the consequences that we are protecting on our side of the house is much, much more important, right? We think that when you are doing this, when you are not implementing this policy, when people are contemplating committing suicide and are able to interact with other individuals, you are abandoning that person as a state. And we told you from the beginning of the debate that the state does have an interest in protecting the lives of individuals, right? The second clash on our side of the house is about the effect of the policy that we give you. And here is where side opposition engaged in a number of tactics to try and nitpick in the kind of things that we told you. The first was to say that the number of times that a person searched on Google might not necessarily indicate that a person might commit suicide. First of all, we think that this was contradictory to the idea that the privacy violations to people are serious. We think that by saying that the number of times that a person searches something on Google isn't actually serious, indicates that they are negating the idea that these privacy violations are grave and are very, very intrusive, like a government going into the bedroom of a person and watching that person. But secondly, we think that the standard that we gave you from the beginning of the debate was pretty clear. If you search 30 times on Google about how to hang yourself without pain, we think that is a pretty clear indication of the fact that a person is willing to commit suicide, right? We think that the alternative, then the next thing that they said to you is that the allocation of resources in the status quo is not enough. First of all, we told you that we think that we are better allocating resources on our side of the house. Because the second speaker talked in his third argument about breaking down the wall between individuals. We think that when government invests resources into this and figures out who is contemplating committing suicide, that we can tell people around that person to be able to interact with those other individuals. And we think that is a very, very good way on our side of the house to allow people to break down the wall between the person who is contemplating suicide and the person around that person who wants to help that person but can't. But moreover, we think that the idea that the assertion that allocation is enough concedes that if allocation could be happening on our side of the house, then they would concede to a policy that allowed for better allocation, which we think, due to the first point, is something that we think is valid on our side. The final thing that they said is that society has to change. But Mr. and Madam Speaker, we think that the only way that society changes that actually improves the situation on our side of the house is when people know about suicides happening, know that the person next to them is committing suicide. But the sort of people that we talked about on our side of the house are people who are isolated, are people who find themselves unable to interact with other people, unable to talk about the problems they encounter in life. The improvement to that interaction doesn't happen unless people have a better way of knowing that a person is contemplating suicide. None of the alternatives that they suggested on their side of the house actually happen to do that. And that's why we don't think that side opposition was responsible in this debate. That's why we don't think that their alternatives don't work. And the only way to actually prevent suicide is the policy that we give you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. and Madam Speakers, this debate is extremely simple, and so is the stance of opposition. We have consistently agreed that suicide is in fact a severe problem that we face in the current society. And we do agree that it is extremely unfortunate that there is a person who is wanting to commit suicide. There was never a single incident in which the opposition told you that suicide is not a problem, right? But we tell you that the 8 minutes that government wasted was basically boiling down to 2 points, although his entire speech was very eloquent. Well, number one is the idea of how suicide is a huge, severe problem that we need to solve, which we agree. But then secondly, he's talking about how we are the ones who are providing the solution. Now today we tell you that the burden of the proposition from the start of today's debate was number one, to show you why there is a mutual exclusivity of suicide and why it is so special about that. And secondly, how does having government counseling suddenly work to solve the problem? We see that there was a huge logical leap that is coming from this. When they say suicide is a huge problem, but now the government is going to solve it, when even the parents and teachers and fellow people who most know these victims can't even solve it either. We said there was an inherent contradiction that was coming from their side. Now today I'm going to be nicely summarizing the debate under 2 important questions. Number one is the idea of when the government can actually infringe upon privacy. Where is that actual line? Because we see that the clash is between the fundamental right to privacy, between saving a life, which they do a very ineffective job of doing anyway. And secondly, I'm going to be showing you how the external consequences of the policy is better exacerbated under their model. We tell you that it will only create more harms, and it will create a negative perception of the government, which are things we do not want. So let's explore our first clash regarding when can government actually infringe upon privacy. We see that from the leader of opposition speech today, we came out very strong, telling you that privacy is a right that we need to respect anyway. Because we tell you that we are living in a democratic setting in which people have the freedom to speech and the freedom to experiment in whatever environment they wish. Because we tell you that the way we resemble ourselves in the private and the public sphere are entirely different. And if the government infringes upon that right for you to freely experiment what you want, and your ability to manifest your destiny, your identity, which is only possible if you have this privacy, we tell you that that is taking away this fundamental right that the nation is built upon in the first place. We tell you that government is not a dictator that can control every citizen's life, just like we don't have CCTVs everywhere. And it's quite ironic when the leader of opposition comes up and tells you, a quote-unquote, a characterization of suicide is something that is deeply personal. And then with the same dirty mouth, they came up and tell us that the government can suddenly explore this idea of suicide when it is deeply personal. We see that if suicide is something that is deeply personal, that is something that the government needs to respect in the first place. Yes?
Do you agree that without guaranteeing the right to life, how can a government guarantee the right to privacy, life precedes privacy?
Okay, we say that that is once again a value judgment that the government is making in the first place. We tell you that that is not something that the government should be deciding, but rather something that the individual should be deciding, right? And the moment that the government actually makes that value judgment for that individual, that is when the society does not function as it is supposed to, because we tell you that it is, after all, a compromise. But when we ask the POI, what about domestic violence and what about terrorism, they simply dismiss this issue by responding, no. But let me examine why this is fundamentally problematic when they simply dismiss these other issues. Number one, it contradicts the very premise and the standards that they provided in the first place, which were vague anyway. They came up and told us if there is a clear harm or an active interest of the government, then it is ability for the government to actually intervene. But what if we tell you that these other things, like domestic violence, are deeply personal as well? And those are things that were not clarified or elaborated in depth by the bench from their side. But we tell you that number two, when the government places a priority judgment that certain individuals must be prioritized, or things like suicide is more important than other issues like terrorism or domestic violence, we believe that that is something inherently wrong. But moreover, last but not least, what about women who are facing domestic violence? What if they
Sir.
cannot voice their own opinions? Is the government gonna make the value judgment for them as well? What if the women are not confident enough to actually voice out and say that I was abused by my husband, and that woman is trapped into a corner? Then suddenly, is the government gonna track down all the instances of domestic violence as well? You see that that is not what should be happening in the first place. And fundamentally, we have shown you why privacy is something that trumps the government's justification to do whatever it wishes, because that standard is so vague in the first place. But let me further explore the second pillar, because we tell you that when they came up and quote-unquote say, we provide the perfect solution, we get to save a life. We tell you that that is something inherently logically wrong coming from their side. Why? Because number one, what they have proposed in today's debate was A, notify the state authorities, and B, redirect them to a source or another website that gives a laundry list of reasons why you shouldn't commit suicide. We believe that it is extremely irresponsible of their side to do that, right? Because we tell you that if the victim has gone so far, anyway, why will the government doing such action will change this mentality in the first place? We believe that the government has no relation whatsoever and should not have relation to this deeply personal matter in the first place. But let's explore further in the second clash what are the different external consequences of this policy. Because we have shown you that even though privacy trumps the saving a life, right, and the idea that they want to propose, which is a clash that we take today's debate, even if that clash does not stand, they were the ones who did not provide a solution. So we see that there are two important consequences that we need to examine in today's debate. Now, number one is the perception of the government, and two is the solution to suicide. So we see that in the terms of the perception of the government, we see that we have clearly proven that it is exacerbated under proposition's policy. Because we tell you that the moment that the government intervenes once, it has the ability to do it twice and thrice. And when they came up and when the government whip, as well as Deputy Prime Minister, gives a justification saying, oh, you can ask Google. There is something called metadata, so you can trust them. We see that that too is something that is very subjective, something that has exacerbated the relationship between the government and the citizens in the first place. What is it that makes Google so objective? Or what is it that makes metadata so objective? And when they say, oh, keyword searches will be the solution, we see that how will that actually be tracked in the first place, right? What if you open the website for like 10 hours? Is that something that the agency will take into consideration as well? I believe that this practical debate can go on forever. And when they start nagging about it, it is not something that can be stopped. But we said it just doesn't end in practicality. It is more impactful on two different levels. Number one, we tell you that this incentivizes the victim to actually open up. Why? Because we need to examine the nature of suicide, ladies and gentlemen. What is suicide? Suicide is a deeply personal matter. And as they have stated continuously throughout today's debate, the victim does not want to disclose their circumstances of what is happening. And then we see that when the government suddenly comes in and wants to figure out everything about what is happening towards the victim, we see that the golden timing that they have constantly talked about in today's debate is blown up, right? It explodes, ladies and gentlemen. The government is not going to solve this problem. We see that the government is only going to exacerbate the problem. Why? Because this golden timing in which the suicide is supposed to be a deeply personal matter is bloated up by the government. We see that is not, you're out of order, man. We see that that is not something that the government should be doing in the first place. But we see that at the end of the day, we see that even the victims of bullies, or even the women who cannot actively voice out their own opinions, these people are even not wanting the government to know about it as well. The solution we have provided, ladies and gentlemen, of counseling or whatnot, is the ultimate solution. Why? Because we tell you that if this victim has gone so far anyway to actually decide to commit suicide, the government making petty efforts is not going to change this after all. We tell you that even the victims who want to voice out their own opinions, or even the women who are constantly abused, should also be taken care of in today's debate, not just the victims that they have identified. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 28 seconds.
Thank you very much. That ends the substantive portion of the debate. We now move to replies and invite the first reply from opposition.
Life is not absolute. Life does not always trump the right of you to have your own civil liberties. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if the government felt like life was so important to all of us that life always trumped liberty, they would put a CCTV in every person's bedroom. They would have mandatory DNA checkups for every single person because that would catch that one crime for that one criminal who might go on to commit more crimes. We think this debate is more nuanced, and exactly because we made that debate more nuanced, we on Team Opposition today take the debate home. I'm going to talk about the two worlds that proposition and opposition said, and I'm going to talk about why opposition's world is better. On two questions. Firstly, on which world better preserves liberty. Secondly, on their supposedly stronger point on who saves lives. So firstly, who preserves that kind of liberty? Because we already told you, we don't believe that life is absolute. And when they come up here and talk about, quote unquote, they said contemplative action, we remind you that our deputy leader of opposition came up here and told you that James Holmes, the Colorado shooter, called a help hotline right before the shooting. It was in contemplative action, yet the help hotline was hung up on him. Later, he went on to kill 23 more people. So we ask them continuously, why is suicide different? And they never gave us a satisfactory response. Because what was their response? They gave us clear harm, imminent danger, active interest, and saving lives. All three of which happens in domestic abuse, terrorism, mass shootings within movie theaters, every single ability with contemplative ability. So they failed to prove to us why this suicide was especially unique, and we think that's especially problematic on their case. But furthermore, we further find it problematic. They don't care about certain lives. They don't care that teenagers kill themselves if they go start smoking and they get lung cancer and wheeze off to death. They don't care if medical insurance leads to tens of thousands of individuals dying. They don't care if domestic abuse makes lives a living hell to live, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's especially problematic when they came up here and said the government's duty is to preserve life in every single ability possible. And then they focus on this little tiny example of suicide. And they say this tiny example of suicide in the wider scale of death caused is somehow different. But they three criteria didn't meet that. Their idea of contemplative interest didn't meet that. Their idea that this somehow was hidden didn't meet that as well, because domestic abuse is hidden as well. And it's for those reasons that our side preserves liberty, and their guise of trying to somehow monitor us within our own bedrooms and our own search engine searches doesn't make sense. On to the second question, on who saves lives, because this is supposedly the harder side, the easier side for them to argue, but even in the end, they lost this side of who saves more lives. Because we look at the allocation of resources, and we told you about the opportunity cost. Not all this agency that tries to stop suicide doesn't always have absolute power. And so you don't find the needle in a haystack by making the haystack bigger. What do we mean by this? We told you, ladies and gentlemen, that in fact, in many cases, the people who search up these individuals are most likely less than 1 in 10 probability that they actually want to commit suicide. Even some people within our team might have searched up things glorifying and encouraging suicide. But the fact of the matter is that the resources that proposition now dedicates to those kinds of trivial matters vastly outweighs the kind of things the counselors might provide. And furthermore, they also talk about using Google, but they ignore Yahoo and Bing in the process. And that might seem like an insensitive joke, but ladies and gentlemen, this further shows how the government has the ability to continually go into these different areas. With the PRISM program, it started with Apple, then expanded into Google, it expanded into Yahoo, it expanded into Bing. So it shows how the government has the ability, once we get rid of this principle of civil liberties over national security, once we get over that principle, that's when the floodgates open. And because they don't even have a FISA court that they've been talking about, because we understand that A, this surveillance program will be unrestricted, and 2, this program of searching whether or not they want to commit suicide or not is extremely inefficient and kills lives, doesn't save lives. We are very proud to oppose. We are very proud to oppose this horrible program. Thank you.
Speakers for 4 minutes and 8 seconds.
We thank the Speaker for the final speech of the inaugural Korea Schools Open, and now invite the opposition leader.
So I have the honor of being the last speaker at the first ever KSO. Yeah. So I think it is prudent that, considering it's finals week from this week to next week, and there are going to be many people who are contemplating suicide because of their grades, I think it's very important that I tell them, or whoever is going to be watching this video in the future, a message. That despite the fact that there are negligent people in this room who value their own ideas of information privacy and value judgment by the government, and that our policies aren't practically possible, which we prove they are, we tell you not to worry because we believe that there are sufficient judges in this room who do respect your right to live and that believe that reallocation of resources can and must happen, and that your right to live is something that we can and must protect. So we're going to tell you why we won this debate, and for two reasons. Firstly, the reason was, are the lives of suicidal people important? And secondly, if they are, then how should we help them? So let's go to the first question. Are the lives of suicidal people important? The kind of clashing idea here was the idea about information privacy versus the lives of people. And they told us that while lives were important, that lives were not an absolute value, which is why if there was going to be gross invasion of privacy, that this shouldn't happen. Well, we'd like to first of all principally dispute this idea that information right is more important than the lives of people. But even if it was, Mr. Speaker and Madam Speakers, we tell you that this infringement is not something that is going to a huge extent. Unlike the NSA, which basically had no perimeters, which had no transparency, we have very clear boundaries as to what people can look at and what they will look at, Mr. Speaker and Madam Speakers. We have very clear ideas about what our purpose is and the kind of information that can be transmitted from Google to the government. And just because we're not using Yahoo and Bing doesn't mean we shouldn't do this at all. If you want to use those two, we can, but no one uses it anymore. But the next question that came here was, what about the other people who are not suicidal but are victims of domestic abuse? Well, first of all, we tried to explain to you why these cases were different. Why we think that there is something about suicidal people, that society has failed them in general, how they're at this certain time where we can save them and we can go to help them, and not doing that would be failing our duty. We told you that kind of differentiation. But even if that differentiation didn't exist, Mr. and Madam Speakers, just because one kind of value judgment isn't implemented in every single case doesn't mean we shouldn't implement this case as well. The example would be seatbelts. The government is interfering with our right to not wear seatbelts, but that doesn't mean the government has the right to save our lives in every single case, right? We think that just because there are certain values that are not implemented everywhere doesn't mean our policy isn't something that can work and will save lives in the future. But secondly, now that we've established that the lives of suicidal people are more important than whatever information infringement that might or might not happen, we tell you how should it happen. Because the opposition came up and told us that parents and teachers can't even help these people. How on earth is the government going to help us? Well, we tell you here that obviously parents and teachers can't help suicidal people because the psyche of suicidal people in the first place is that they don't want their parents or teachers to know, that they already feel abandoned by these people, which is why they are not willing to seek out further help from these people. We think it's important, therefore, that the suicidal person doesn't have to look for help, that help will come to that person, which is why we believe our government policy of informing families, informing parents and teachers, or even sending people directly if we believe the need is there, is something that can more directly help people. It's not directing you to a laundry list of why you shouldn't commit suicide. It is action that is taking place. It is action calling your parents, going there directly. There's all these kind of things that are preventing the needless suicidal deaths that are happening every day. So to conclude, Mr. and Madam Speakers, we have already failed people who are feeling suicidal by neglecting them in the greatest time of need. So we believe that it is therefore more important for us, government and society as a whole, that when we absolutely can help these people, we absolutely should.
Thank you very much. So speakers, I invite you across the floor, shake hands.
We go out.